This year marks the 20th anniversary of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission report being handed over to our founder, President Nelson Mandela. Although the actual anniversary is on the 31st of October, we have opted to hold this event today because we hope to harness the rich insights that emerge out of tonight's conversation to disseminate and engage on wider public on various platforms in the build-up to the actual anniversary. During Madiba's presidency, government decided on an array of special instruments for redress and reparation. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission was one of these key mechanisms for confronting our country's past. Established in 1995, the TRC delivered its main report to Madiba in 1998 and concluded its business in 2003. The TRC mobilized all South Africans across various political and racial divides to engage in individual and collective memories of the past and to debate the importance of memory in the process of reconciliation, envisioning the future and nation building. For Derrida, the TRC could be considered as a place of archive. The archive as being not simply a recording of the past, but also something which is shaped by a certain power, a selective power, and shaped by a future interior. Although the TRC was deemed a success by some people, it has also been heavily criticized for its many limitations. Some scholars have argued that it began its work with a meta-narrative in place and simply generated an archive to support its meta-narrative. Accused of a political bias, some people have also argued that the TRC process has failed to meet the expectations either of its creators or of its intended beneficiaries. This event is a very important event for us here at the NMF, as it forms part of the broader inquiry into Madiba's legacy. Upon his retirement from public life, Madiba gave the foundation the mandate to do social justice work through dialogue and memory work. With this mandate, we endeavor to be meta-reflective as we attempt to reckon with the past and use the lessons learned to assist us in charting a way forward. Given these trying times, we as a society owe ourselves the difficult questions. Firstly, what does the work of the TRC signify today? Secondly, why did its recommendations find such little purchase? And lastly, what happened to Madiba's reconciliation project? And is it too late for us to go back and revisit the recommendations? To wrestle with these questions today, we are joined by fascinating presenters. We kick off with a panel discussion facilitated by Chandra Bull. We then move over to the launch of the archival activism report by Dr. Mbumiseni Buthelezi. This will be followed by a launch of the Presidential Years online resource by Razia Saleh and Jessica Peach. And then the evening comes to an end with some closing remarks from a member of our Board of Trustees, Professor Carolyn Hamilton. So to start off with, from my far left, I've got Mr. Imtiaz Kaji, who is an activist who's waged a long and successful campaign to have those responsible for the murder of Ahmed Timor held accountable. He's a member of the Timor family and a long-serving public servant in the intelligence establishment. On his right, we've got Ms. Sylvia Graham, who has a master's degree and does contract work for the Nelson Mandela Foundation and was the leading activist in the Feesma School and Afrikaans School campaigns at the University of Pretoria. In the middle, we've got Chandra Gu, who is a renowned scholar, author of a number of books, a senior manager at the Institute of Security Studies, and was lead investigator for the TRC on Apartheid chemical and biological warfare program, and she will be facilitating the panel discussion. Right next to me, we've got Dr. Newell Solani, who is a historian, a senior manager at Ditsong in Pretoria, and served on the steering committee of the archival platform. I want to thank all the speakers today, and I will hand over to Chandra.
Thanks very much, Patronella. Thanks. Good evening, everyone. The 4th of October 2018, Nelson Mandela Foundation, Johannesburg, 20 years since the end of the Truth Commission. And for those of us who are involved in it, it feels both like it could have been yesterday and a lifetime away. But one thing is absolutely certain to me, and that is that we are living in a very much better country than we were living in 1995, 96, when the Truth Commission started, or in 1999, when it finally wrapped up. It's true. We remain deeply divided along lines of race and class. But I think we're beginning to have a conversation using a new vocabulary, thanks in part to Fees Must Fall, that is enabling us to have the kind of conversations that remain stuck for a long time after the Truth Commission, and perhaps even during the Truth Commission. One of the things that we still battle with in our society is high levels of violence. And in my current position, it's something I'm very conscious of. In fact, I've probably been involved with violence, whether it's state violence or criminal violence, for the past 30 years of my life. When one looks at the murder rate in South Africa over the past 100 years, you see an interesting pattern emerging, and one that's quite disturbing about where we're at right now. We see that in the mid-1980s, at the height of resistance to apartheid, the murder rate starts increasing until it reaches a peak higher than it was in 100 years in 1993. 78 per 100,000 died in 1993. And then we see a radical decline as our society settled down and as we transitioned. But that decline reached a point of change in 2011. And right now, our murder rate is much the same as it was in the mid-80s, which tells us that we've got a lot of work to do still. And I think that this conversation tonight is in part about the work that still needs to be done. And I hope our orientation tonight and our conversation can be about how we can achieve the change that we hoped for in 1994 and 1995. Of course, the Truth Commission, when it was established in early 1996 after the passing of the legislation at the end of 1995, had a twofold intention. On the one hand, to document and record and hear the stories of what had happened in the past so that it could no longer be denied. On the other hand, to achieve reconciliation. And both are unfinished. I joined the Truth Commission in 1996 when I was 26 years old, and you can see I'm a lot older than that now. And it changed my life, and it changed the lives of those who are close to me in fundamental ways. And I know that there are many individual stories of how the Truth Commission impacted individuals, individual families, but I think we're here tonight in part to hear some of that, but also to hear the collective story about how it impacted us as a society. And I'd like, in our conversation, to pursue three themes as we try and answer the questions you posed, Petronella. The first is around the relationship between justice and healing. The other is around remembering and forgetting. And the third is around the uncomfortable stories that perhaps we still don't know how to tell. So I'd like to start with you, Sylvia. People of my generation and positionality tend to want to teach or think that we need to teach people of your generation about the Truth Commission. And even in the recommendations of the Truth Commission, it was about making sure that it wasn't forgotten, that in fact one of the recommendations was around continuing to fund innovative projects to remember, and it's part of the grade 12 curriculum. So what does it signify for you and your peers now?
So, Chandre, I started school in 1999. That's when I was in grade 1. And having gone through the curriculum, and I studied history, so I was very passionate about history. But the way in which the Truth Commission was incorporated within the curriculum, I felt as though it didn't have much impact. I started to engage more with it after matric, listening to people's stories, hearing about its unfinished business, because that's something, an association that people often make with the Truth Commission, that a lot of work was started there, but there's a lot of unfinished business. And much of that unfinished business then rests on my generation. So these things were set up. I was actually explaining to a colleague earlier that it felt, looking back, it feels much like an event. It was an event rather than a process that needed to carry through and be sustainable. So it's very difficult for someone like me, born in 1992, started school in 1999, and then now coming to terms with what the Truth Commission was trying to do and realizing the many gaps that are there and having to pick up or try to pick up from that.
So what, being where you are right now, what kind of spaces do you think could enable the conversations you feel need to be had? What would address that unfinished business, if you like, for you?
I think that is a very difficult question, but I would reference Fees Must Fall and what it tried to do, and I would zone in on, because Fees Must Fall had breakaway movements, right? And I participated quite passionately in Afrikaans Must Fall within the University of Pretoria, and I think that for me was a marker of work that still needed to be done, and that was taken up by my generation and fellow comrades within that space. I remember quite clearly when, things started to break down on campus, and we had a clear division between students, of black students one side and white students one side, and that was captured within photography by the media. And when I saw those pictures coming out, I really started to wonder, how far have we really come, and is the university space then conducive to absorb such things? Because when we brought those things forward, we were met with a lot of resistance, not only from students that benefited from the status quo, but university managers, academics, and that raised a lot of questions for me, operating within a space that should promote diversity, should promote critical thinking and challenge things as set up in society.
Absolutely. So in many ways, I think one of the experiences that we had as investigators in the Truth Commission, and I see peers here and Commissioner van Wyk as well, one of the things that was very powerfully painful at the time was the extent to which particularly white people ignored what was happening in the Truth Commission, switched off their televisions when the hearings came on, and in a way retreated behind the denialism that we are seeing in discussions around white privilege still right now. So coming to you, Noel, as a curator of history, if you like, through the museums that are part of Ditsong, what do you think the role is now of museums in relation to telling the story? How can we be challenging that?
Probably let's start by thinking, what is the role of memory in society? I think, in my view, and probably that's a view shared by many people, we have a need to remember because we need to learn from the experiences of the past, number one. But number two, we also have a need to correct the faults, if I can use that word, of the past. Number three, for the majority of people, they need to find closure in terms of that particular past, because without closure, they continue to have this open kind of living, things that have not been repared. And museums in themselves are spaces of remembering. They are spaces where we need to reflect on the past. We can reflect in different ways, but mostly we reflect in terms of the kinds of exhibitions we developed, which become signifiers of our past. A simple example when we talk about what I call, or what many people call, presentism. When we criticize the TRC today, we use the present experience and forget the experience that used to exist, that was there. I mean, I came of age in the 1980s, and there are several events I remember about the 1980s, which were a result of the total strategy of our PW board. One is the Lesotho massacre. Two is the killing of Tamim Nyele in Botswana, an artist. Three is the Nkomati Accord, which I never understood. But those are the three events that I remember. Therefore, when we say link memory to museum, then what are we saying exactly? I think we are saying one of the things we need to do for people and generations to come to understand the context in which certain decisions were made. We need to understand this background. But for those that were inside the country, there are also several things that we will remember. One, we will recall the killing fields of the Israel, Katlehome, for example. We know that many young people engaged with the police on the ground in what became later known as self-defense units, SDUs. But for those that were organized as students in high school, you will remember the burning of Xhosas and subsequently the state of emergency that followed, and the arrest of many young people who saw themselves in prison. You know, when Van said, will I agree to be part of the panel, I called Mkondo Mfazwe, and Mkondo is from Newport. And he went to the TRC and testified. I don't know why, but he did. And secondly, I called Mkoli Sefako, and he said he was going to come, but I don't see him yet. Mkoli Sefako is from East London. He went to the TRC, and I don't know why. Because at the time in which we were all engaged together in some of the activities, we will take decisions collectively. But this particular decision of testifying in the TRC and narrating your story is an individual decision. And it had to come from an individual to say, I need to go. Therefore, I think in answering your question, I think museums should become safe spaces where this memory is represented, but where this memory is discussed, dialogued on, so that we continue to ensure that we do not forget. However, having said that, it will be funny coming from a historian. There are some things that we need to forget. Thank you.
I'll come back to that because I think that's an interesting statement. But I'd like to bring you into the conversation now, Imtiaz, and you've been pursuing, a central part of your life really has been pursuing the truth around what happened to your uncle. And you just mentioned closure, Noel. I mean, is that what you're after?
Yes, thanks, Chandra. But I think before I expand, just to touch on some of the points that Dr. Solani has made, because it has direct reference to me and the Timol family. The first is that my maternal grandmother, Amma Timol's mother, refused to testify at the TRC hearings. She could not understand why must she go and relive the horrors of the past. And I had a special bond with her, and I convinced her, and I said, Ma, look, it's important for you to testify. And she went, she made a passionate plea to get more details about what really transpired. Obviously none was forthcoming, because none of the security branch officers who were living were ever subpoenaed or even applied for amnesty. And 10 months after her testimony, she passed on. So at that particular time, like you, no grey hair, politically unaware as to what was unfolding, and having only one mission at that time was to find out about this uncle of mine. So I couldn't really grasp and contextualize the political implications at the time as to where the perpetrators were, why were they not asked to testify. My objective was solely to find out who was this man and why did he sacrifice his life. So that's the first thing. As Dr. Solani speaks about memory, you know, there's a question that I grapple with all the time, especially in a democratic South Africa, that we are so good at commemorating anniversaries. Matola raid, Chokabi, and the list continues. But nobody wants to find out what really happened. And as a victim's family, this really haunts me, that these brave men and women who sacrificed their lives, whose comrades are now in the corridors of power, are simply not interested to find out who was responsible for killing them. And many victims' families, because I've engaged with many of them, embrace the TRC and the restorative justice process instead of opting for the Nuremberg trials. But I think the important aspect there is restorative justice. And we're very well aware that going this particular route of the TRC, it would mean that perpetrators would get amnesty. But they weighed that with the option of saying, at least it was give us some glimmer of hope that we will finally get the truth and we'll get some form of closure. And the TRC also made it very clear that they were going to dangle the carrot, tempting perpetrators to come forward, and there was still a stick wielding behind, that if you don't come forward, the stick will be wielded. But today, when I engage with so many victims' families, if you ask them that if they had known that the ruling party had failed to identify these perpetrators and deal with them accordingly, I'm rest assured that many of them would not have gone to the TRC, embracing this reconciliation process, the restorative justice process, knowing very well that the perpetrators were not willing to come forward.
You're suggesting a betrayal.
We can put it. Look, we can put it very politely and very mildly. Again, if we look at the reopening of the Timor inquest last year, and the subsequent charging of 3 security branch officers, who again witnessed my grandmother's horrific testimony at the TRC, witnessed my book launches, the exhibitions that were held, never approached by the NPA, and the only reason that João Rodrigues was found was because his daughter had made contact with me. So betrayal, I think, not just the Timor family. And again, just to share some of the plight of the victims' families, when I embraced on this journey, I would visit bookstores, and I would always scan the index looking for the name of Timor. And whenever I would see the name of Timor, my eyes would light up. And today, obviously, with the energy and the effort put in, his name is known in a democratic South Africa. So that is why whenever I get a chance to speak, I speak about all those other families who till today are desperately hoping and just praying just for the names to be mentioned. I mean, the Krerok 4, Guguletu 7, Joe Kabi, Matthew Mabelani, and the list is endless, Imam Harun. And these are the families that I'm engaging with. So if we talk of betrayal, I mean, one can come to no other conclusion. Why is it that even now, when we reach out to João Rodrigues to say, even at the age of 80, you failed to apply for amnesty, you were never subpoenaed, the 2017 inquest clearly found that your evidence was false and hence you must be charged. Come forward, make full disclosures, set a new precedent in this country to bring perpetrators and victims together, and yet he's sticking to his version of 1972. So betrayal, most certainly.
The fact that his daughter came forward suggests an interesting dimension here, and it raises again a question about this following generation and whether the kind of healing, acknowledgement, and perhaps even justice that one is seeking, not necessarily formal justice, but restorative justice, as you say, might even be possible through a next generation. Do you feel that is it?
I'm not sure, because when we speak about the next generation, we're very critical of the process and critical of even the leaders that brought us to where we are. You know, the sellout terminology that has come out. But I think we also tend to contradict ourselves in that these processes might have shortcomings and might have not yielded the results that were intended for the people that brought it together, but also for the intended beneficiaries. But I'm always interested by fellow comrades that then reintroduce the process when, you know, you look at Fees Must Fall with Shackville in UCT, and now we look at Nwebo Dlamini, Bonginkosi Kanyile and the likes, and we're bringing it back. So was it really a process that didn't work completely if our generation even falls back on, you know, that framework? You know, we're in trouble. We need to be heard. We need a space, and we bring back the idea of the TRC.
Interesting. I mean, Noel, you were talking. You alluded to the format of the Truth Commission being discomforting, requiring individual testimony rather than acknowledging a collectivity in action. Do you want to expand on that, perhaps? Was there another way of doing this?
Look, my observation of the TRC is that one political organization made their presentation to the TRC. Within one of the political organizations that I followed, the ANC, they took a collective responsibility for what has happened in the camps, etc., and everywhere else. Whether that was good or not, I don't know. However, within that collective responsibility, it left others having misgivings, like Winnie Mandela, who had to go and testify on her own behalf as Winnie Mandela, and her testimony was not included in the collective responsibility that was taken by the ANC. Probably that has got its own context, because we can't discuss these things without context. But certainly, for what I was alluding to, is that, and using the example of Umkhonto Mfazwe and Mxolisi Faka, is that they felt the need to go. Mxolisi was the leader of COSAS in the border region when many of the student killings by the Siskai regime, Sellout regime, took place. So he felt the need to ensure that the memory of those students is remembered, is not forgotten. Because through his testimony, he spoke about his own experience, but also the experience of those students. Umkhonto, on the other hand, testimony, which I asked him why he channeled it in that particular way recently on a phone call, focused on him and detention. Obviously, he felt he needed a space in which he can talk about his own pain and unbundle himself to people who might listen to his story. But I think there are some people who felt that, look, we're involved in a struggle for liberation. We knew that those people, those men and women, hated us. Probably we equally hated them. And therefore it's a conflict. Conflict is messy. And where it is messy, there's going to be blood. And where there is blood, there's going to be death. When there is death, there's going to be pain. And at the time the TRC took place, they have not yet transcended in order to understand that it is not only about them, but it's also about their relatives, their families, and other people. So, I guess what I'm trying to say is some people were not yet ready when the TRC came, and some people were still celebrating the 1994 breakthrough. Now, whether the TRC in terms of timing came early or late, I can't answer that question. But I think it was about readiness and age. In retrospect, I think if the TRC had taken place 10 years later, probably would have attracted more people who would have been prepared to go and talk and try to find answers to certain questions. I guess that's what I was alluding to.
I'm going to open it up now because I think we have about, Petronella, am I right, about 15 minutes?
No, we have about
20 minutes, great. So it seems like a good moment to bring you all into the conversation. So the questions, comments around the room.
Hi everybody, my name is Leanne from SELM and I'm the founder of Cohesive Social Solutions, which has been doing restorative justice for the past 21 years in South Africa, the UK and Australia, and now going into African countries. I'm not an academic, which I'm very proud of because I've got my PhD from the hard knock. But the one thing I wanted to ask is, we've spoken about restorative justice in this conversation, but the definition of restorative justice is that offender will make amends to the person who they harmed or damaged. And in terms of this context, what plan was put in place for those people who were part of restorative justice, made amends to the families and the victims whose lives they damaged so badly?
Thanks. Would any of the panelists like to pick that up? Maybe I should give that to you, Imtiaz.
Well, I think from my own experience, Chandra, it appears to me, again, remember being very, very naive in 1996 when my grandmother testified that it was just a platform for victims to come forward and to relive the horrors of the past. And I think perpetrators knew very well that the TRC, which at that particular time was given the responsibility to pursue these particular cases, did not have the adequate capacity and resources to fulfill this. And once it was transferred and handed over to the government of the day, the matter simply just disappeared out of the agenda. And that is why in 2003, when I phoned one of the security branch officers in Afrikaans, Sylvia, he made it very clear to me that he doesn't see any reason why he should speak to me. I needed to look at the inquest records of 1972, that nobody was responsible for the death of Mativa, and that he was well aware that my maternal grandparents had passed on, and said I must just continue with my life. So it was as if perpetrators knew very well that Eugene de Kock and Dirk Coetzee would take the fall for all these apartheid era crimes. And then as the government moved on and transitioned from the first administration to the second administration, victims themselves would lose the stamina and the energy, and the matter will just disappear. And that is precisely why, despite the fact that the Timor matter has been reopened, the Neil Agate and Nokutula Similani cases that were presented to the NPA way before the Timor matter have still not moved. And you can speak to many, many other victims' families throughout the length and breadth of this country, that they were visited by NPA officials, they were made empty promises, they collect the information and the evidence from victims' families, and then they simply just disappeared. But I think that is precisely why that the Timor matter is so important, because it gives a glimmer of hope to all the other families that if we could succeed in reopening the Timor inquest and take this matter of João Rodrigues further, And if he ever decides to clear his conscience and to make full disclosure, it opens the path, like Dr. Solani is saying, maybe years later, to create another opportunity for perpetrators and victims to come forward. But to answer the question, for me at that particular time, and Piers is here, you were here from the TRC at that particular time, I think you were just overwhelmed with all the cases that you had to handle. And that is why initially I was very critical of the TRC, like I think many other victims' families. But I think only through conscientizing and doing additional research, then the picture became clearer to me that the TRC was an initial phase of this massive project. It had to be handed over to the government of the day, which had the capacity and resources, to follow these cases through. And the record speaks for itself, and that is why the Timor matter is the only matter, where some progress has been made, and hundreds of other cases throughout the length and breadth of this country have not moved 1 inch. Right. And the danger, finally, is that perpetrators like all of us move on. So another 10 years would have meant that generation of perpetrators in the 50s, 60s, with age in the 80s and 90-year-old, and now like Rodriguez, who can't remember anything.
I think what was important, and I'll come to you next, Piers, we're now discussion before we started, is, and it's relevant to your question, is that what you were looking for, and what you have been looking for and offering right up to this moment, is a restorative process. Just tell me what happened, and then we're not going to pursue prosecutions because you're looking for answers. But there seems to be such a reluctance to even acknowledge that anything happened, and I think it feels very stuck. So the question, I suppose, for us all is whether there is any space for any of the recommendations from the Truth Commission that haven't been realized to be picked up now. Piers, putting you in.
Yeah, thanks, Chandra. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Piers Pigu. I was an investigator in the Truth Commission. Just on the issue of recommendations, and it's something that we've used the South African experience to engage with others that have worked on Truth Commissions and working in Truth Commissions since the South African Commission, is that we failed in that committee that was developing those recommendations to, I suppose, build champions within the community and essentially in this country political champions to drive those processes forward after the Truth Commission. And so they kind of withered on the vine very, very quickly. And of course we had a political construct in the country that was determined to shut down a number of those issues. I think a big issue for me has been that the post-Truth Commission truth recovery focus has been essentially on prosecutions, and there was always only going to be a limited traction on cases around prosecutions, and there is an enormous amount that could have been done using other innovative truth recovery processes. You essentially have, with the Truth Commission report, a meta-narrative populated by lots of individual stories, but no community stories. Very few communities in South Africa have a history of what happened and how they would relate to that meta-narrative, and I think that's a huge gap that could still be filled. It's important to remember that, as you were pointing out, whether it was too soon after the violence, the vast majority of people that came to the Truth Commission came in relation to the violations that were perpetrated in the 1990s. And many of the victims and survivors of that were even too young to apply for reparations. And there was a huge fight after the Commission around reparations, which many of you will remember, with the government trying to shut down on a closed list, activists trying to push like Kulmani for an open list, and I would argue still there is space for an open list, because a number of victims, for instance, if you were a child whose parents were killed in 1993 or 1994 in Katoris, how on earth would you be able to apply for reparations? Or educational benefits, or all these kinds of things. So there are enormous opportunities that were missed and dropped by the government, who parked a selective number of those issues in a small unit inside the Department of Justice. It was a huge political failure, and my animosity or anger about that goes very much towards the Mbeki administration that shut this down. And that they lost an enormous array of opportunities to carry those processes forward. And it did not have to be through a retributive lens. I mean, it's important to remember that part of the problem that Intiaz and I have been talking about for years is there was a deal made on prosecutions, an unwritten deal. This was told to me by a lawyer representing many of the security police, that if they ever started coming after the security police, they would go after the ANC through the civil courts, and they would shut them down. And this has not been explained as part of a whole series of issues around the deals and compromises of 1994 that have not been explained. And so I think, with issues surfacing around the failures, the betrayals of that period, it's incumbent on people to go back to those who were party to those deals to put pressure on them to come clean on what those really meant for us to understand why we are in this space at the moment. So I think the relevance of that period is still very much in play today.
That's right. And I was reading the recommendations again earlier today, and it struck me that there were really important recommendations around higher education and access to higher education for people whose education had been interrupted in the early 1980s. And also a proposal for a once-off wealth tax, and then other forms of keeping that reparations bucket full. And I just wonder if we'd be sitting in the same kind of country, in the same kind of situation as we are now, if those recommendations had been followed. These Smithfore would even have been necessary.
Hi everyone, my name is Rita. I've got a question for Dr. Solani. It's about your comments about museums as spaces of dialogue. And I totally agree with you, but I wanted to ask you if you think our museums are doing that. And the reason I'm asking is I actually spoke to a female member of Play, I think about 2 years ago. I was doing research on struggle songs, and she said specifically that there's nowhere that she can go that tells a story. She said there's no book that she feels accurately tells it. And she described songs actually as the only thing she has. She said it was a mobile monument. So I guess I just wanted to ask you about, do you think our museums also, dealing with these issues of how do you tell the story of Apartheid and the TRC, if they really are sites of dialogue, or are they failing in that duty?
A short answer would be the majority of museums are not doing that. That's a political answer. However, there are certain pockets of museums that really do focus on dialogue. The Nelson Mandela Museum being one of them. And they have conducted many dialogues at times in partnership with the foundation and hosted conferences on archives, deepening democracy, etc. So there are certain museums that do that, but most do not. And I think the reason that they do not, there are fundamental structural reasons that exist in our museums in South Africa. And also there are certain administrative pressures that are there and certain deliverables that must be met. Because dialogue presupposes that you give time, you enter into conversation, and etc. It's not ticking the box. and I think at times as museums we are caught in a space where we have to tick the box that we delivered on A, B, C, and D. And I think that's where the fundamental challenge is. However, I still believe that should we move in a constructive way towards doing that, we will be immensely contributing to some of the national projects which the state itself desires, like nation building. And will also be engaging with some of the language we see re-emerging in our country. I don't think there is anyone who can deny that there is a re-emergence of ethnicism in the country. It's there. We can say it's racism, some outburst here and there that makes us all of us to boil when they come out. And I think as safe spaces, museum can positively contribute in addressing that. On the previous question, I have the platform so that I shut up forever. I think fundamentally, what were the objectives of the TRC? There are many commissioners and people who were in the TRC here. Fundamentally, from those of us who were looking at the TRC in television and reading about in newspapers, it seems to me there were two fundamental reasons for it. One was testify, and testify. Two, if you give full disclosure, then you will get amnesty. So the incentive was amnesty. Probably the secondary incentive and the tertiary incentive was restorative justice. But the fundamental and the primary incentive was getting amnesty. And it was hoped that, I think, by full disclosure, people will be able to identify where their relatives are, what happened to them, where, when, and by whom. But then the incentive was amnesty. That's why you got a lot of people going to the TRC with brilliant lawyers. I'm not against lawyers, I love them. But they went with brilliant lawyers so that they could guide the narrative in ways that will ensure that they do get that particular amnesty.
I think there was tremendous frustration, certainly by those of us who were investigating amnesty applications and watching amnesty hearings and seeing actually how few amnesty applications there were, that it felt as though members of the security forces were only coming forward if they knew that we had some information anyway, and would only come and testify to about what they knew we knew anyway. That there was absolutely no commitment to full disclosure at all, and I think that history has borne that out. Certainly in your experience, that's true. But I'm going to push you on your controversial statement, because I'm always struck by the fact that Namibia and South Africa took very, very different routes in relation to dealing with the past. I think the dominant belief in South Africa seems to be that if we don't deal with our past and we don't talk about our past and remember it, acknowledge pain, we can't heal and move forward and be a well society. Namibia took a completely different route and has refused to deal with the past in any way at all. It's silenced. And I've experienced this myself in many different ways in trying to follow up with the 200 people who were allegedly thrown from aircraft into the sea by the South African Defence Force. And we don't even know who they might be to today. And it amazes me that there are not families in Namibia asking the questions about where their where family members are. And yet if one looks at the two societies, very different demographically, very different, certainly in terms of population size, but we had a very different approach to dealing with the past, and the impact now, I'm just asking, did Namibia make the right decision to forget? What are the consequences of that forgetting as we're discussing the consequences of this remembering? Are there things that we need to forget?
I will leave that to Professor Hamilton to respond.
You're not looking at me serious.
Right. Can I
Hi, I'm Didebo Khodiai. I just wanted to ask, especially from people that are involved working with the TRC hands-on, is do they feel that the whole process is responsible or has contributed to where the country is right now? For instance, I was born in the state of emergency, and there was lots of that violence, and you'd hear that people had to throw eggs, kids, and there were fires and that, and there was just a whole lot that was going on. And I'm not too sure because I don't have the stats in front of me, but it would be interesting to see the correlation between the perpetrators of violence now and the people that lived through them there, and who were, as was said earlier, too young to apply for these reparations, where it was made like this is for the whole nation, but yet we're only dealing with victims and perpetrators, not with everybody. That's the first one. And secondly, to go back to the women that were in the MK. So having seen a couple of museums in the rest of the continent, they'll have usually maybe a small space dedicated to the women that were part of the struggle liberation movements, but they never mentioned. And I was just thinking that even when we speak about what happened in the Quattro camps and with the MK soldiers, it's always what happened between the males, and that in some readings that I've done where it was found that it was actually said, it was decided that the women will not testify about what happened in there. And the TRC as itself, taking that blanket approach to give liberation movements blanket approach, do they not feel that has contributed even to the attitudes of men and women towards women, both black and white, whether it was the men that were on the border, whether it was the men that were in the MK camps, and excluding them from the TRC or allowing their leaders of their movements to get this blanket amnesty? Does the TRC not feel that that has had an impact on the levels of violence and just general attitudes towards women in South Africa currently?
Yeah, I can share with you. I mean, just if you look at the Timor matter, Mrs. Amina Desai, whom my uncle used her home to do his underground work without her knowledge, was imprisoned for 5 years at the age of 52. And after her release, she was still banned. And till the end, when I knew her, she had absolutely no remorse for my uncle and for his actions. But to respond in a broader context, my experience has been that I think when victims' families testified at the TRC, they sort of just gave up. That in the Timor family, it's the same thing. That it's over, it's done, we live with this grief, we accept the reality that nothing will happen, and we accept the status quo. And this is exactly what I went through. I mean, so when I grew up and I would ask questions about my uncle, you just get a blank stare. Why do you want to find out about him? What do you want to accomplish? And you won't succeed because his political party is not interested in keeping his memory alive. So how are you going to succeed in keeping his memory alive? So, you need to understand it in a broader narrative. That yes, we mention the name of Ahmed Timor, but nobody mentions the name of Amina Desai. So all these unsung heroes and heroines simply vanish of the annals of our history. And like me, when I started with my introductory comments, I would scan those books just to look at the line with my uncle's name. And this inspired me then to publish my book on my uncle, and inspiring me now to publish my second book. Because I understand that if I did not do this, and like I did up till 1996, I kept on talking about it, then, my uncle's name would have just disappeared off the annals of history. So the unfortunate reality is that when you look at exhibitions, but this is what we've done, from the Timor family perspective, we have to raise funds. You need to establish your own networks and your own contacts. And then build networks with Mandela Foundation, BITS Historical Archives, Biko Foundation for support and so forth. So, at the end of the day, the victims suffered during the apartheid era. They continue suffering in a democratic South Africa. Perpetrators operated with impunity during the apartheid era, and they continue living with impunity in the post-apartheid era. And then it boils down to victims' families, to take on the struggle in complete isolation of the political parties that these members, these men and women belong to. And the reality is that again, engaging with all these victims' families, they will still support the same ruling party who their loved ones belong to in a democratic South Africa. So you see the irony and the challenges that victims' families face. You just don't win. And hence, opportunities like this creates a platform for us to keep their legacies alive, keep their names in the public domain. And that's why the museums, the exhibitions are important, the curriculum in schools are important, that not just on a few people, few individuals. And this is exactly what Madiba spoke about. A complete collective, men and women throughout the length and breadth of this country. But we've narrowed it down to an anniversary, and we make it a big anniversary with lots of speeches. We don't want to implement the principles of which these men and women had died for and sacrificed for. And then we don't want to know who was responsible for killing these people. And many of those responsible for killing are still living. Many of them are still living, continue to watch these processes unfolding, like Rodriguez did.
Thank you, Yes. I think do we have time for one more question?
Okay, my name is Tandega.
Okay. Tandega.
Okay, my name is Tandega Gulenberg. I'm just intrigued by the comments that some things are best forgotten. Because in my experience, that forgetting is not really it's not possible for human beings. And that which is forgotten recurs. And then it recurs much worse. I'll give you an example. I work for the SABC. I was one of the SABC 8. And after testifying about the wrecking of that institution and its political control and draconian measures to control the narratives coming out of the institution, after testifying in Parliament, we went back and looked at what was said in the Truth Commission by our former board members, Sambicha Blanche, the former bosses, Van Zale, and Becky somebody. The testimonies were almost identical 20 years later. Give you another example. The Stratcom list was given by McPherson to Dumisa Nzalenza and to the commissioners. It was never made public. 20 years later, we are Stratcom, and yet we were never on the original list. So and it leads to lies and to not knowing the truth leads to many perversities, and they are visited generations later.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Well, you wanted to reply, and you can have the last word then.
No, I was just going to say, she answered your question. When she talked about women activists in the camp. But that also needs to be understood in our context. I mean, for a long time, Caroline Hamilton, Ben, and others thought that in this country there is triple oppression of women. Women are oppressed, especially black women. They are oppressed based on their color. They were oppressed based on class. They were oppressed based on gender. So it doesn't necessarily mean because women were wearing uniform in MK camps that they were all of a sudden equal to men by virtue of them wearing uniform. There might have been a resemblance of equality, but it doesn't translate into real equality. And it's because of gender issues that continues to this day. And I think your question on correlation between the perpetrators then and now is a difficult one to answer. But you answered her question. I wanted to thank you for that.
And I want to thank you also for raising the issue of gender. I think the gendered nature of testimony in the Truth Commission and the gendered nature of the Commission itself is something that we haven't spoken about nearly enough. So I hope that can be the subject for a future discussion. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much to the panelists for a fascinating conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Please give the panel and everybody else a contribution. Before we move on to the next session of tonight, I also just want to say that this was a very fascinating conversation that was had right now. A couple of ideas coming through around betrayal, disillusionment, but most importantly about a country that was born out of activism, a country that's still worth fighting for. And what is clear is that there's still a lot of work to be done, and we're still here to do that work. But also, as Sylvia has cautioned, to be careful to dig deep as to how we do that work so that we don't reignite and return without being cautious about what it is that we're actually doing in those actions. So once again, I really want to thank you for a fascinating conversation. And when we have drinks, if everybody still has more questions, they will be available downstairs to answer any other questions that you have. And ladies and gentlemen, talking about activism in this country, next up we've got the launch of the Archival Activism Report by Dr. Mbongiseni Buthelezi. Dr. Mbongiseni Buthelezi heads up the Public Administration Research Institute, is a widely published scholar and public intellectual, and has worked closely with the archival platform for over many years. This project was done by the archival platform partnership between the Nelson Mandela Foundation and the University of Cape Town, and it follows a State of the Archives report which was published in 2016. This report the 2016 report was so well received that the team felt that there was another story to be told, one of activist archives outside of the state. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Dr. Mbongiseni Buthelezi.
Thank you, Petronella. This evening, what we are doing is we're celebrating the completion of this report. We're celebrating the work of a number of colleagues who are sitting around the table, primarily Joanne Duggan, the director of the archival platform, sitting next to me, who's driven this project for the last, I want to say a few years. I don't know, it feels like it's been a very long time that this report has been coming. But also Carolyn Hamilton, whose stewardship this report has been produced. But more than that, there are a few other people who've been part of the process. The steering committee of the archival platform was comprised of Vern Harris, Noel Solani himself, Njabulo Ndebele, who's not with us this evening, and I also played a minor role. The project, let me start by, before I go into that, let me just pull a thread from the previous conversation. The one thing I have found quite striking in the conversation is that in all that has been talked about, what remains very clear and stands out in my mind is the question of unfinished business. But the unfinished business, in order to take the work forward, we need to, I think, as Noel said, tell stories, dialogue, and he talked about museums and spaces where that can take place. Imtiaz, you talked about the story of your uncle, but you also mentioned a lot of other stories that have not been told. And Sylvia talked about how the new generation, the Feast Must Fall activists, also need to look back and not repeat some of the things that may not have been very successful in previous struggles. But what that leaves me with is a thought that what is clear is that the stories that we've heard are only partial. They are always going to be partial. The context that Noel talked about, that we try to reconstruct in order to be able to understand the decisions that were taken in the negotiations at CODESA, for example, that is also always going to be partial. But the link for me to what we are talking about, to this report, is that this report celebrates the work of archives, activist archives. And those archives, I think, are critical because those partial narratives and the further stories that we need to tell, we need to turn to those archives in order to in order to reconstruct some of the stories. And they're always, as I've said repeatedly, always going to be partial. But the archives offer us an opportunity. They offer us somewhere where we can turn to when, like in Tia's, we write books to try and tell the stories. When, like Noel mentioned, we try and put together exhibitions that can be spaces of reflection, of thought, spaces of dialogue in museums. And here are some archives that we want to celebrate in this report. This report was commissioned in 2015 by the Atlantic Philanthropies. The Atlantic Philanthropies for almost 2 decades it funded projects that combined the activism and archiving in South Africa. And the idea of commissioning this report was to assess the scope and impact of the activist archiving that has taken place in post-1994 South Africa. And also to try and take stock of the new kinds of activist archiving that were beginning to emerge. So the report covers the work of the South African History Archive, SAHA, among others. I'm not going to mention all of them. The Gay and Lesbian Memory in Action, Gala, the Maibuya Center at the University of the Western Cape, the Noblunga Kumete Reconciliation Memorial in KwaZulu-Natal, as well as the Legacies of the Apartheid Wars projects, the Human Rights Media Center in Cape Town, and coming to closer to our present moment, beginning to look at what other forms of activism, activist archiving were beginning to emerge. And it thinks about the Nelson Mandela Foundation, the Parliamentary Monitoring Group, and most interestingly, a film like Mine Has Shot Down, and the way it has archived some of our more contemporary struggles in South Africa. And finally, Roads Must Fall and Fees Must Fall. What I'd like to spend the next few minutes doing is to then make what might seem a bit of a strained link, but I want to make a link between Archives Reckoning, which is the title of this event this evening, Reckoning with the Past, and the current moment we're in particular, what we've been talking about an awful lot in South Africa, state capture. So what's the link? This last panel was about reckoning with reconciliation. From today's vantage point, we are reckoning with and wrestling with the meanings of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which was itself a reckoning that it had taken place between 1960 and 1990. It is 20 years, of course, as was mentioned by Petronella at the beginning, since the TRC report was handed over to the then President Nelson Mandela. 20 years in which much else has happened that we need to reckon with, including new forms of state violence, some with similarities and parallels to apartheid era state brutality that the TRC was a reckoning with. And here what comes to mind is the Marikana massacre. It's the violent suppression of Fees Must Fall protests that we saw not so long ago. But the question I want to ask is, what activist archiving do we need today, in addition to the work that has been done by Gala, by Saha, by Roads Must Fall? And I'm thinking here of people who have archived what happened in Fees Must Fall, such as Wandile Gasile. In the era of state capture, what activist archiving do we need? Let me tell a little anecdote about something that happened last year to make the link. Sometime early last year, in 2017, at the Public Affairs, not Administration, Research Institute, we had a project in Nelson Mandela Bay where we were looking at the evolution of governance over a 20-year period. One of the things we've been trying to negotiate for over 2 years was access to the archives of the municipality. And the team that was working there had various engagements with archivists, with various, including Petronella actually, various people in the municipality, in shared services to gain access to the archives. Eventually, it was decided, let's go and have a meeting with the senior leadership of the municipality, and let's negotiate a protocol about how they're going to let us give us access to the archives. So a bunch of us flew down to PE. We sat in this meeting with senior leaders of the municipality, and we agreed the process. The process was they were going to give us a finding aid that they developed that would help us map out what they had in the archives. And then the team, Petronella and two other colleagues, would then be able to request particular documents, and those documents would be made available to them, subject to certain conditions. The team stayed on in PE to continue working. I flew back to Joburg, and then I followed up with an email just to confirm what we'd agreed. The response was a flat denial that we'd ever agreed such a thing. We subsequently found out, Petronella and the colleagues who were working in the municipality subsequently found out that the reason for that flat denial that we'd ever made such an agreement was that some of the people who'd been sitting around that table were part of a network that had been dislodged, but a network that had had a very strong hand in the capture and the looting of the coffers of that municipality. And so there were people sitting around that table, people that whose permission we needed more than anybody else, who were interested in sitting in that meeting and making sure that we did not get access to the records that the team wanted to get access to. So, why does this matter? I think, thinking back now and reflecting on the previous conversation, in the 1990s, when the TRC was set up, apartheid loomed large as what needed to be reckoned with. But when I think about the vantage point of today, I'm thinking here of the State Capture Commission. What's looming very large as something that needs to be reckoned with is the last 10 years of the Zuma administration. It's the corruption and state capture of the last decade. But what has been crucial in the conversations that have happened in the last week and a half is that the Gupta leaks as a new form of archive, and the way in which those emails, those hard drives were spirited away and hidden at the last moments is something that for us today has been maybe in some ways a saving grace, and is going to be key in our reckoning with the last decade, when we finally really do reckon with that last decade. The making sense of state capture, as it has come to be called, is only at this point happening at a very, I wouldn't say superficial, but it's only at its beginning stages. I think for a long time to come, we're going to be reckoning with how state capture has proceeded at provincial level, at local government level. And here, I think Crispin Olver's book, How to Steal a City, on Nelson Mandela Bay, has been a useful start in thinking about at local government level how the state has been captured. What we found, Petronella can tell you stories about this, is that a lot of people hold records, either systematically or in very chaotic ways. Records that are the beginnings, I think, of the kinds of archiving that we're going to need to reckon with the past of the last 15, 20 years, but especially of the last decade. And so we're beginning to see, to my mind, the emergence of new forms of archiving. The importance, I think, of those forms of archiving for social justice is something that is yet to become visible to us. It's something that we're yet to make sense of. But what we were seeing in the process of the Zondo Commission is that they may already have helped us to avert the wholesale subversion of the state for narrow interest of a small power elite centered on Zuma. The last thing I want to leave us with then is that at the same time as we celebrate these new forms of archiving that might be beginning to emerge and that might have already saved us from South Africa becoming a train wreck, is that simultaneously as these forms of archiving are emerging, there are other kinds of more subversive archiving taking place. And here also what stands out for me is that the intelligence reports that have been produced, the intelligence reports at the center of the firing of Ntantaneni, itself relied on a certain kind of archive that perhaps resides in some shadowy corner in the intelligence networks. And so archiving is going on even as we watch, and is being put to use in ways that we are only just beginning to make sense of. And so with that, I'd like to say congratulations to Joanne, Carolyn, and colleagues for this amazing report that you produced here. Katie, of course, yes, Katie Mooney, who also played a crucial role in this project. There are copies of the reports available at the back here, and I'd like to pause here and invite any other colleagues. I've said very little about the report, if anybody would like to add anything, and if anybody has a question or two for us to open up for a conversation for a moment.
Just to say, we've got 10 minutes for questions, and you can pose the questions to any of the contributors to the report, and if you can just put up your hand and I will direct.
Just one thing I want to add is that one of the things that the report shows so vividly is how terribly vulnerable archival activists are. So the Gupta example is perhaps the primary one. But and that's about a real insecurity of those who try to defend the contested record. But the attempt to keep alternative archives afloat is an impossible attempt, finally. That's what the report really shows, is that the funding to keep a record for posterity so that it can be engaged and re-engaged is almost impossible. So that many of these fantastic efforts at archiving that happen outside of the big institutions eventually can't find the funding to keep going. And they then have to fold. And the question then becomes, what happens to those records? And one of the findings is that in many cases, the records end up in the universities. Is there another place that these records should be ending up? And I do think that's a question to be thought about. We can't leave the activists out there with total responsibility for their own extraordinary work. It's an unsustainable situation, and all the will in the world can't make it sustainable. And I just wanted to put that point there.
I'll just link to what Carolyn has said, and that is, I think, another important finding is the degree to which the activists hold responsibility and custody of the records. It's dependent on energy, it's dependent on context, and when activists move out and away from the records become inert. The records are not used. And what makes them useful is that constant activation by people who are interested in keeping the social justice movement going forward.
I would like to speak not about myself, but about my profession. And I want to make an appeal to all within the profession, outside the profession, not to forget the contribution that was made in order for justice to prevail during the apartheid regime. I don't want to give any details. I do believe that people of present have to look at my 92 background, 92 years. But please, I would appeal, do not let us be to sort of passing by what the legal profession tried to do during the apartheid years. Many were put behind bars. Many, to start off with, is the Amazes, who led 3 of us in the main case, the death of Timor, where the police managed in the first round to lie as best they could in order to exonerate the government, the police, and the others for the death of Timor. It took, how many years was it last year?
46.
46 years to change that judgment by judges who believe in the administration of justice. We managed, thanks primarily to their family and the individuals. Last year, in October, was it?
Yes.
For us to be able to turn it around. That Timor didn't fly through a 10th floor window, but he was obviously thrown through the window, held by the knees, and threw him out of the 10th floor window. I don't want to become personal, but I cannot speak about the Legal Resources Center, which I have been, I don't know how many years, 40 years, that was involved in the legal case. Is involved in Dr. Agathe, who was said to have committed suicide, which we believe we may be able to turn in the very near future at the instance of his family, because he was found dead. And we actually submitted 20 similar fact evidence of people wrongly said to have committed suicide. We called 8 of them when the magistrate, senior magistrate, said that he had had enough of our aid. He was not prepared to listen to the abattoir, despite our protests, besides our appeals. We know in the LRC where I worked that there were no less than 65 people that were killed by the security guards during that period. the families of those who have been encouraged by Timo. And what I'm asking you, and I don't want to say too much what the LRC is doing and what it's trying to do, but please do have regard to what the past tried to do and encourage what the future can do. We rely in your generation. Thank you for listening.
Thank you. I've just got 3 more minutes for one last question before we have to wrap this session up. Does anybody else have something to ask or say anything? Yes,
So I just want to say, taking from what Uncle George just said, when you're introducing the archivings and all the processes that you had to get them, when you mentioned the importance of the law profession, especially given that we're talking about, you were mentioning state capture, what we've just heard about like a Judge Kruel, how then in the future are we able to then ascertain that what is archived is what was said to be if we're having the Judge Kruel to come? I don't know, just the statement about the importance of the legal profession, like who will hold the guardians to account, like who's overlooking them, like in what role does that play within collecting material and archiving? And like when you said before the stratcoms, like you were able to go back to the TRC and hear what they said and do that, but that was because it was in that instance. Like, is this an ongoing thing? Do people reference all these things that we archive? And how do we know what the truth is?
Okay. Not to abuse my chair position. But I think the interesting question that you're asking, referencing back to the story that Monsignor was telling, is that my interest and intrigue when it comes to this kind of report is that it shows the little spaces in which people do their part. You're asking who's holding the overseers accountable. When we were doing research that Monsignor was referring to, how we broke through and found archives that we weren't given access to by the state is because constantly there were people within the state like who are activists themselves. They kept documents. Sometimes they stole documents for us. It was all about that idea that because they remembered what happened in the past and how when this institution itself failed, they had to become present and do the work. There's a colleague a former colleague of mine at Paris who's doing work on the life of documents, which seems like a strange topic, but he traces how documents have a life of their own and the implications of which. He traces how it is that we can use archives and disqualify certain archives which are created precisely towards your question. So I think when all else fails, we have to trust that there are people who at their core understand that we have no choice but to ensure that this country works. Does anybody else?
Can I just make a quick point just on the archives to give us some glimmer of hope? The reopening of the Timor inquest last year, Judge Polimote ruled that, or made an order, that all the security branch officers who were involved in the Timor matter, their files must be made available. And miraculously, they were all found. But all my attempts over the years, ask peers, to get access to those files bore no success whatsoever. But when he made that order, all the police personnel files were made available. And we found critical information in those files that helped us for a successful turning of the 1972 inquest. So the point I'm making is that there is ample archive material available in state archives repository all over government departments. But the question is whether there's a political will and who's holding the keys to those doors, preventing us from getting access to those archives.
Thank you for that. It's really fun to tag us. Ladies and gentlemen, please give one last round of applause to the team. We've come to the second last portion of our night. where we will be launching the Presidential Years online resource, which will be presented by Ms. Razia Saleh. Ms. Razia Saleh is a senior activist at the Nelson Mandela Foundation, and she will be presenting to us the online archive and telling us the backstory to how it came about.
Good evening, everybody. I'm not going to get a live demonstration. It's a PowerPoint demonstration. We just didn't think a live link-up would work well. I've been in workshops where it fails miserably, so we decided not to go that route. So you're welcome on your cell phones and you'll be able to log into the website. About 10 years ago, while sorting out various files of documents that we in the archives had inherited from Madiba's office, we came across various pieces of writing in Madiba's distinct handwriting. After analyzing this and consulting Zara Lafranji, we came to the conclusion that this was the manuscript of the book Madiba had been writing about his presidency. We named this collection the sequel to Long Walk to Freedom, Madiba's autobiography that started off on Robben Island in 1976 and finally published in 1994. As we were sorting out the papers, we found more and more of the manuscript, and not in any particular order. Through careful sorting and arrangement, we identified 10 chapters of various lengths with varying amount of writing and rewriting. About a year later, we came across a bound, typed-up manuscript which confirmed the order in which we had organized the manuscript, and it was this that became the basis for the book Dare Not Linger. Madiba had started writing in 1998, and by the time that he stepped down as president of the country in 1999, he had acquired a researcher, Tambeka Matumari, who is not here today, and the documents and files from his office as ANC president and as deputy president was delivered to his home to assist in this writing process. He emphasized that in his retirement he would be writing and have time to complete the book, as he told journalists at that time. The first 2 or 3 years will be occupied in writing down my memoirs as president of the country, and there's going to be little time for anything else. However, the reality was far distant, and the much longed for downtime proved to be elusive. In fact, Madiba was as busy as ever, and without the support base of his office and staff in the presidency. This quickly led to the formation of the Nelson Mandela Foundation as his post-presidential office, supporting him in a range of activities that he was interested in keeping. From building schools to HIV/AIDS work, from research into education in rural areas to peace and reconciliation interventions. This hectic schedule was grueling and left very little time for writing and introspection, and the memoirs were never completed. Excerpts from the sequel manuscript featured in the book Conversations with Myself, published in 2010. When he passed away, Mankrasa Michel wanted this unfinished project of Madiba's to be completed as much as it could be. 2 people who had worked in Mandela's presidency office were identified to do what they could with the guidance of Mankrasa, the Nelson Mandela Foundation, and a few others. The task was given to Joe Nechitenze, the head of communications in Mandela's office and a close advisor of the president, and Tony True is sitting here, who managed communications research. The brief was to fill the gaps of Mandela's draft, following an outline he had decided to work around after consultation with colleagues. Foremost was whatever could be found in Madiba's own voice, notes and drafts in the archives of his pages, an inveterate writer and rewriter of notes and drafts from jotting on scraps of paper to fully written speeches these speech writers knew nothing of. All handwritten as never to typewriters all the work was written. In the record of Parliament, the ANC and media. Then there were insights of people who worked closely with him, many of whom had been interviewed at one time or another, and many of whom did interviews expressly for this project. There were also records of the ANC and government, including the cabinet, which kept traces of the events and decisions, the policies and developments of those years. The account, reading Mandela's words, his colleagues' insight, documents and media accounts, and a factual narrative is the core of this mini site. But it was not yet a book. It needed the touch of a writer to make it seem so that it was not only readable by a wide audience, but matched the inspirational tenor of Mandela's life. Mandla Langa took the draft and its resources, adding his own insight, experience and research, and produced Dan of Hunger, a book with wide appeal that captured Mandela's voice and visions and thoughts with the touch of an artist. Something the book could not do, though, was to give readers access to the rich resources it drew on. Books must therefore stop at footnote pointers. This website, wherever it can, gives browsers to the original sources. The Nelson Mandela Foundation hopes that this online archival resource will draw you not only to the contents of its own archive, but encourage people to explore the richest preserved archives in libraries across the country. That it will remind us that history can't be told or decided once and for all, but needs constant refreshing by checking our understanding of it against its trace in documents and in the memories of those who lived in and helped make it. This site has been designed to showcase some of the many resources and research processes that took place in the course of the development of Daniel's India. It has been optimized for use on mobiles. Hundreds of artifacts, both digital and paper, are linked within. We invite visitors to explore the 4 levels of information. The main text is divided into 7 different rooms containing 19 sections. The text has been written with 3 sets in terms of voice. Firstly, Mandela's own voice. Secondly, the voice of others who work to engage with him. And finally, a narrative voice that weaves the account together. Each voice is styled for visitors to distinguish who is speaking. Since today's dialogue is on the TRC, the section on the slide that you see is the section on the TRC. There are 4 levels of interaction with further information available in how the text has clicked through. Wherever we can, the site links visitors to the original sources. That's an original source about the TRC. This project has drawn on many people and institutions, on memories and insights of people who played a part in the event, on the archives and the archivists who are the custodians of documents that endure where memory fails, or on historians who have reflected and written on these years. Their contributions are acknowledged in the text and the footnotes. Special acknowledgement, though, is due to those who worked with Nelson Mandela during his presidential years and who generously gave their time and shared insight with conversation and interview. Both Joel and Tony were invaluable, especially in filling in the gaps and unpacking the nuances. Tony, especially when the proverbial extra mile in ensuring that this mini website came to fruition, from writing to proofreading and fact-checking and attending countless meetings with the NMF and the web design team. Namibia's first draft of history has enriched this second draft, thanks to the sponsorship of Sellout, who could draw on the print media archive. SABC staff spent days retrieving audiovisual material in the Mandela Profile Archive. Without a grant from the Industrial Development Corporation, the research would not have been possible, nor would Diana Finger or this presidential website be possible. A special thanks to Jessica Beach, who is sitting at the back, who arrived from down under in April and owned this process and made it happen. Her tenacity, dedication, and enthusiasm have made it possible for us to deliver this product tonight. The archival team here at the NMF have utilized images from our gifted photographs collection to populate the Presidential Years website. Several of these images are from our recently digitized film collections, where many of the photographers remain unknown. Over the past 20 years, these photographs were given to Mr. Mandela or to the Foundation for safekeeping and to use in the service of our memory and dialogue work. If you have information about any of the images showcased here on the Presidential Years website, we would love to hear from you. Thank you.
Thank you. I am told that Mr. Tony Tree here. Here he is. Yes. So he'd like to take the floor and say a few words.
Apologies to the backbenchers. Okay, thank you. Thanks. I'd just like to, first of all, just say what a huge task this team did. It was listed there. It's a big document with lots and lots of footnotes, and they had to assemble and get correct the interaction of literally thousands of pieces of work under tremendous pressure due to factors beyond their own control. And I wasn't sure if they would deliver. They have done. So I think they really deserve acknowledgement. And when I started on this, I was new to archives. And it was quite a shock at first. Instead of finding particular things, you find bundles of things. And instead of catalogues, you can find things called finding aids. And the idea of this project was to open up archives to people without that very specialist background you need to help contribute to understanding of history. I think, as a former speaker said correctly, the present rewrites the history every generation. But it doesn't do so unaided, and I think that the archives would contribute and would help. And I just want to give two examples of the kind of experience I had in digging through archives, because what happens, I'm sure it's going to be much easier now with all this digitization, but still people will need to go through mountains or whatever the right images for things that are digitized of data. And then every now and then you will come across things that just stop you and might either enlarge or even unsettle accepted history. And I'll just give two examples, one of which relates to the TRC, and the other is to do with economic policy. And there is a well-established story that Nelson Mandela, sitting in prison, sort of fell behind the curve of development of ANC's thinking about policy, came out sort of unreconstructed and shouting fire, and then through his interactions gradually was moderated until he came to the World Economic Forum and did a U-turn. That's one, I think, very familiar narrative most of you know about. But as we talked to people, as we plowed through the archives, the possibility of a different narrative came about. And this was of a leader who had the task of leading an organization who at last had the opportunity of a policy conference even before he went to prison, and managing a transition to the current time with respect to that policy. And what makes this a possibility, I'm not saying this is the conclusion, but there are various things in this work that you can look at. One was interview with Vali Musa, who was on the National Reception Committee and had the job of putting together Mandela's first speech, and protested when Mandela wanted to say some of these things about nationalization and Mandela, de Klerk a man of integrity, and Mandela explains to him the strategy behind saying these things. I won't say more, but you can read it. The other was a little bit of paper with about 3 sentences on it, which Mandela wrote between December 89 and February 1990, just weeks before he went to the Economic Forum and a couple of months before the Ready to Govern conference. And on this little paper, just about 2 sentences, a few words. Need to change our economic policy, conference. So the question that arises, was this someone who'd been out of things when he encountered contemporary society, did a U-turn, Or was it a leader strategically managing a transition that he wanted or knew had to be made? So that's a question that just arose, and it's through going into the archives that I think these questions are raised. The other relates to the TRC, not so much because I think one of the important aspects of the TRC is what I think was touched on, I think by the speaker from the museum, was its genesis and what went into making it. But what struck me in listening to the discussion was the kind of binary polarities that were put. Was it justice or reconciliation? And a whole lot of these, including unspoken, I think, it's like the TRC is a moment between past and future without a present. And I think one of the things that is picked up rather obliquely, because it doesn't deal with in a lot of detail, is that the TRC was also an intervention in the present. And I think there were two important ways. And one was vividly brought back to me by the events which Thandeka mentioned, when untrammeled rumor threatened to overwhelm society and unleashing harm on people who may or may not have deserved it. And I don't know if others remember, some of you look a bit young, in the weeks and months before the TRC started its work, there was this process suddenly of rumor taking root in society. Suspicions about people, who was an informer, who did this and who did that. And I think one of the services of the TRC, without discounting all the other problems, was to channel all these uncertainties, these suspicions, in a manageable way. I think the other thing that comes out again is just touched on, and I was reminded of it by Chandra's comments about the murder rate. It also played a role in combating the rate of violence at the time. It was preceded by the investigative task unit, but there was also interaction between them, which contributed to a process of reducing the space for those who were still there and wanted to foment or implement violence. And so I think that also shouldn't be forgotten, that it was not just about let's account for the past to see what the future can be, but it was actually a material intervention. And so when you talk about the present, I suppose the question that arises, is there something else that could be done now that might be an intervention in the present? So I think that there are lots of other examples, and we hope that people will take the opportunity to explore this. I think there are probably more questions than answers, because politicians, I think, are and should be fairly inscrutable. So in public, so often what is interesting about the archives, there's a lot of stuff Mandela writes to himself. And you can often see the difference as maybe anger gets modulated into quite a bland statement that he makes publicly. But exactly what the truth is and what not, I think is an open question, and we just hope that it will stimulate people to dig into things and be ready to revise things that we might believe with quite a lot of conviction. Thanks.
President Carolyn Hamilton is one of South Africa's most eminent scholars, an inspiration, and a key driver of numerous archival projects over the years, including the archival platform. And she is also one of our board of trustees here at the Nelson Mandela Foundation. So it's only appropriate that she was close up the night.
Well, thanks very much. I'm mindful of the fact that you're all desperate for those refreshments. But I was very struck by Tony's last words about dig deeper and by that last exchange between Syllable and Petronella, guardians, and then the subversives who come forward with the document. And I thought the whole of tonight's offering make us want to think, what does it mean to couple archive and dialogue? Because on the face of it, it looks like they're opposite things. It feels like archive is that dusty place of preservation and confinement. And dialogue feels like the place of public engagement, really out there, listening, hearing, thinking, and debating. But I think what tonight really shows us is that the making and the maintenance and the contestation of archives are public acts. And they require commitment, political will, and resources. All this preservation for posterity and even the engagement, the ability to go back, to dig deeper, to challenge an existing archive, all of this is typically undertaken by those who have somehow power and resources. It's those who set up archives who, for the most part, determine what gets preserved and what does not. Activists challenge the monopoly of the record by government and by elites. And they often make sure that things enter the record that those with the most power don't necessarily want in that record. Activist archives use records to mobilize people, to contest manipulations of records, to challenge fake claims, to assert rights. They argue for open archives and access to records and to the right to contest. They assert that archive is a place of activity. And I think what we're doing tonight is insisting that it's a place of public activity. So it's important to recognize, I think, that the keeping of archives in the forefront of public discussion is to make a very particular move. It's to insist that the record is always open to consultation and reconsultation and contestation. In other words, the presence of archive as a foundation of dialogue is to say that there is never only one point of view, never a single authoritative story of the past. Open archive, and it's the plural here that's really, really important. Open archives are preconditions for dialogue and for public participation in political life. They are the bulwark against the powerful setting the terms of the discussion. So the TRC is not history firmly in the past. It is archive, open for discussion, demanding discussion. We cannot just celebrate the TRC. Every archive in itself is limited. Every single one, even the most admirable of those activist archives. Every one of them is contestable. For that reason, we have to celebrate decades of work by those who've done much to establish archival alternatives in public life, as well as those like the Foundation who do indeed go and publish the book, The Presidential Years, and make a particular argument, but they also insist on opening the archive of the Presidential Years, opening it up for discussion, for public engagement. So we've got formal thank yous. We have to thank a whole lot of people who aren't even here, founders of activist archives discussed in the report, for their vision. Some of them are here, actually. And tireless workers in those archives whose jobs were much, much more than merely professional. We thank the investigators who drove the making of the TRC record and those who've done much to try and keep it in the public domain where it belongs. We thank the archival platform for a decade of work, culminating in this third and final report, in striving for the recognition of archive in public life. And we thank the Foundation's Archive and Dialogue program. I think they work tirelessly to avoid hagiography of Madiba and to use the legacy to campaign for archival openness and dialogue in public life. They can't do this celebration of the centenary year without doing it tonight. Because we have to insist that even the presidential years are open for discussion. So we thank tonight's speakers and the thoughtful panelists. Petronella, thank you so much for cheering us through this discussion and helping us to somehow navigate complex things and pull them together. We thank the Hans Syllable Foundation for supporting this endeavour. And a final thank you to all of you who came out tonight. We know that public discussion actually takes place in the various electronic media, but it often takes a face-to-face event like tonight to generate the materials that pollinate those electronic media discussions. Tonight's thoughts are not confined to tonight. They must circulate outwards into public life in many ways, and they will, because you're going to walk away from here and do something that's informed by something you heard tonight. And funny enough, the events themselves become part of the record of public life. A public life lived ethically by those who speak actively to reckon with the past. So thank you all.
Please do not say that Nelson Mandela let the people of South Africa down. I was party from 1985 to the present day, who was a confidant of Nelson Mandela, visiting him in jail, reporting to Lusaka, reporting to London, reporting to some of the northwest countries. And he would not make any decision without the reports of all these groups of people who were interested in South Africa becoming a democracy. He stood for it, he said it, he criticized, he was not unduly impressed by anyone. It was suggested that our learned friend, who is sitting, who was here tonight, we were on different platforms. He for the nationalists, I for the RNC.
Leon Vessels.
Just let him come. I'm told that we have to finish. But he and I were in the same group. We had to agree, as were the other three groups, before it was said or handed to Nelson. Sort of saying, yes, it is with me. The idea that Mr. de Klerk talked him out of the rights of the people is not a fact.
Thank you.